Ambassador stood before the Galactic Council and listened to his new assignment with mild amusement. The tall diplomat had served the Council for over 300 cycles, visiting more than 200 species across the known galaxy. He had seen wonders that would break lesser minds and faced dangers that would send most beings running. But this mission seemed almost boring compared to his usual work. Humans had finally left their home system. After centuries of slow progress, these short-lived creatures had built their first colony on a distant world. The Council needed someone to assess them, to determine if they were worth integrating into galactic society or if they should be quietly contained before they became a nuisance. Accepted the task without hesitation. He expected to spend a few rotations observing primitive beings and then return with a simple recommendation. His ship entered the human solar system on a clear morning by Earth time, watched the blue and green planet grow larger through his viewing screen, and felt nothing special. He had seen countless worlds, many far more beautiful than this small rock orbiting an average star. The humans had not even colonized their own moon properly yet. They were barely taking their first steps into the darkness between stars. Landing coordinates brought him to a city called Geneva, where the humans had established their diplomatic center for alien contact. Stepped off his ship and found two humans waiting for him on the landing platform. The first was a woman with calm brown eyes and dark hair pulled back in a simple style. She wore a formal uniform that marked her as someone important. The second was a man with an easy smile and relaxed posture, his uniform slightly less formal than his companion. The woman stepped forward and extended her hand in the human greeting gesture, had studied their customs during his journey and knew to accept the handshake. Her grip was firm but not aggressive. "Ambassador, welcome to Earth. I am Morgan, Senior Liaison Officer for the United Earth Diplomatic Corps. This is my colleague Danny, our cultural advisor. We are honored to host you during your assessment." Studied her face for signs of fear or excessive reverence. Most species treated Galactic Council ambassadors with nervous respect, understanding that his report could determine their entire future. But Morgan looked at him the same way she might look at any visiting official. There was politeness in her expression, professionalism in her bearing, but no trace of the anxiety he usually inspired. Danny grinned and offered his own handshake. "Long trip from the core worlds, yeah. We have got a whole schedule planned for you, but first things first. Are you hungry? Tired? Need anything before we start the official tour?" The casual warmth in his voice caught off guard. This human was treating him like a guest rather than a judge. It was strange but not unpleasant. "I require no rest," said. "I am prepared to begin my assessment immediately." Nodded and gestured toward a waiting vehicle. "Then let us show you our world, Ambassador. We have nothing to hide." The tour began in Geneva and expanded outward over the following days. Visited their centers of government, their places of learning, their cultural monuments. He observed humans in their daily lives, going about their business with the busy energy of a species that knew their individual time was short. They lived barely a century on average, sometimes less. By standards, they were practically mayflies, brief flickers of consciousness that burned out almost as soon as they began. And yet they built things meant to last. Their cities were designed for generations they would never see. Their institutions carried knowledge across centuries. They planted trees whose shade they would never enjoy and wrote books for readers not yet born. Found this puzzling. Most short-lived species focused only on immediate survival. Humans seemed to think in longer terms despite their brief existence. Proved to be an excellent guide. She answered his questions with honesty, never trying to hide the flaws in human society or exaggerate their achievements. When he asked about their conflicts, she did not pretend they were peaceful. When he asked about their failures, she acknowledged them without shame. This transparency was unexpected. Most species being evaluated tried desperately to present only their best face. Danny added context that the official briefings missed. He explained human humor, which found baffling. He described human recreation, their strange obsession with games and sports that served no practical purpose. He talked about human art and music as if these things mattered as much as technology or military strength. Perhaps to humans, they did. On the fifth day of his visit, stood on a busy street in a city called Tokyo and watched the crowds move around him. Millions of humans occupied this single urban center, packed together in densities that would drive most species to violence. And yet they flowed past each other without collision, adjusting their paths in constant small corrections that kept the whole system moving smoothly. He watched more carefully. A woman shifted her bag to one side a moment before a rushing businessman would have struck it. A child stepped slightly left just as a group of tourists turned unexpectedly. An elderly man slowed his pace almost imperceptibly, creating a gap that allowed a young mother with a stroller to merge into the flow. None of these adjustments were conscious. None of these humans looked at each other or communicated in any obvious way. They simply knew where the others would be and moved accordingly. Had seen hive species coordinate their actions through chemical signals. He had seen telepathic races share awareness across distances, but these humans had neither ability. They were individual minds, separate and disconnected, and yet they moved as one organism without apparent effort. He noted this observation in his report that evening, but marked it as a curiosity rather than a concern. Crowd dynamics were hardly relevant to a species assessment. There were more important matters to consider, such as their technology, their resources, their potential threat level. The Galactic Council did not care how humans walked through their cities. Still, something about that afternoon stayed with as he prepared for sleep. He had evaluated over 200 species, and none of them had made him feel quite so watched. The humans had been nothing but welcoming, and yet he could not shake the sense that behind every smile, every friendly gesture, every casual joke from Danny, there was something he was not seeing, something they all shared that he could not access. He dismissed the feeling as fatigue from extended travel. Tomorrow he would continue his assessment with fresh eyes and clearer thoughts. There was nothing special about humanity. They were simply another young species reaching for the stars, unaware of how vast and indifferent the galaxy truly was. He was certain of this, almost certain. Requested access to human historical records on the morning of his 7th day on Earth. He expected the usual story of gradual development, slow progress from primitive origins towards spacefaring capability. Every species followed roughly the same path. They learned to use tools, built societies, developed technology, and eventually reached for other worlds. The details varied, but the pattern remained constant across thousands of civilizations. Morgan did not take him to a library or a data center. Instead, she drove him to a quiet place outside the city of Washington, a vast field covered with white markers arranged in perfect rows. The morning air was cool and carried the smell of freshly cut grass. Birds sang somewhere in the distant trees. It seemed peaceful, almost pleasant, until understood what he was seeing. "This is Arlington National Cemetery," said. "These markers represent some of our soldiers who died in various conflicts. There are more than 400,000 buried here, and this is only one cemetery among many." Walked slowly between the rows. Each marker bore a name, a date of birth, a date of death. So many of the deaths were young, barely past the beginning of their short human lives. He calculated quickly in his mind and felt something cold settle in his chest. "You fight among yourselves," he said. It was not a question. He had reviewed their history before arriving, but seeing the evidence spread across this silent field made it feel different. Real. "We have admitted. Many times, some of our wars killed millions, tens of millions. The worst of them killed even more than that." Danny stood nearby with his hands in his pockets. His usual easy smile was gone, replaced by something more serious. The Second World War alone cost around 70 million lives, and that was less than 100 years ago. We have gotten better since then mostly, but we remember what we were capable of. Had seen species destroy themselves through internal conflict. He had seen civilizations tear themselves apart over resources, ideology, or simple hatred. Those species were no longer among the stars. They had burned themselves out before they could spread beyond their home worlds. And yet humanity was still here. Still building, still growing, still reaching outward. "How did you survive?" he asked. Turned to look at him with those calm brown eyes. "We kept going. What other choice was there?" She arranged for him to meet a man named Frank that afternoon. Frank was old by human standards, his hair white and his face lined with decades of living. He walked with a slight limp and sat down carefully in the chair across from. Despite his age, there was something solid about him, something that refused to bend. Frank had been a soldier in several conflicts. He spoke about them without drama, describing battles and hardships with a matter-of-fact tone that found unsettling. The things he described would have broken most species: extreme temperatures, limited supplies, watching companions die, being wounded and continuing to fight anyway, being captured and surviving through sheer stubborn will. "You endured conditions that would have killed members of most known species," observed. "Your physiology is not particularly remarkable. How did you survive what you describe? Frank shrugged as if the question was strange. You just do. You keep putting one foot in front of the other because stopping means dying, and you have people counting on you so you do not stop. But the trauma, the psychological damage, most beings cannot recover from such experiences. The old soldier was quiet for a moment. Oh, it leaves marks. Do not let anyone tell you different. Some of us carry weight that never gets lighter, but you learn to walk with it. You find reasons to keep moving. Family, friends, the people who came after us who deserve a better world. You do not recover so much as you build something new around the broken parts. Left that meeting with more questions than answers. He had expected to find a species weakened by their violent history, traumatized into submission, or hardened into brutality. Instead, he found something he could not easily categorize. Humans broke but did not shatter. They bent but did not stay down. They carried their wounds and kept walking forward. Took him to a hospital that evening. She wanted him to see how humans treated their sick and injured. The facility was clean and efficient, full of advanced medical technology and skilled professionals. But what caught attention was not the equipment. It was the people. He watched a young nurse named Maria Santos move between patients with quiet efficiency. She had been working for 16 hours, explained, covering for a colleague whose child was ill. Maria's eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but she smiled at each patient and spoke to them with genuine warmth. When an elderly man became confused and frightened, she held his hand and spoke softly until he calmed. She could rest, said. Others could take her duties. Why does she continue? Because her patients need her, replied. Because she made a promise to care for them. Humans take those promises seriously. Observed for another hour. He saw doctors working past their scheduled shifts. He saw families gathered around sick loved ones, refusing to leave. He saw strangers offering comfort to other strangers simply because they happened to be sharing the same waiting room. Nobody was abandoned. Nobody was left alone to suffer. On his world, they had efficient systems for caring for their ill. The weak were treated or not treated based on logical assessment of their potential contribution to society. Resources were allocated according to careful calculation. It was sensible, practical, and entirely reasonable. Humans made no such calculations. They poured resources into those who might never contribute anything again. They fought to save lives that offered no strategic value. They wept over losses that a rational species would simply accept and move past. It was inefficient. It was illogical. And watching Maria Santos hold the hand of a dying man she had never met before that morning felt something shift in his understanding of this strange species. He returned to his quarters that night and sat for a long time before his communication terminal. The council expected a preliminary report. They expected him to classify humanity as he had classified so many species before: safe or dangerous, useful or worthless, integrate or contain. He stared at the blinking cursor and found that the simple categories no longer seemed to apply. Humans were violent and compassionate. They were fragile and impossibly durable. They killed millions of each other and then rebuilt their world with the survivors. They exhausted themselves caring for those who could never repay the kindness. Had spent 3 centuries evaluating species for the Galactic Council. He had never hesitated before. He had never been uncertain. But as he began typing his preliminary assessment, he found himself recommending further study instead of immediate classification. His superiors would find this strange. He was finding it strange himself. But something about Earth was not fitting into his categories and had not survived 3 centuries by ignoring what did not fit. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that he should be worried. He ignored it and sent his report. Danny extended an unusual invitation on the 12th day of the assessment. He asked if would like to attend something called a family barbecue. The ambassador had studied human customs extensively, but this particular ritual was not covered in any diplomatic briefing. Danny explained that it was simply a gathering where families cooked food outdoors and spent time together. It seemed trivial, hardly worthy of an official observer's attention. Accepted anyway. He was beginning to understand that the most revealing aspects of humanity were not found in their government buildings or military installations. They were found in the small moments, the ordinary interactions that humans took for granted. The family lived in a modest home on the outskirts of a city called San. When arrived with Danny, he found the backyard already filled with humans of various ages. Children ran across the grass chasing each other in some game, whose rules seemed to exist only in their imaginations. Elderly relatives sat in comfortable chairs under the shade of a large tree. Adults clustered around a cooking device that produced fragrant smoke, talking and laughing over the sizzle of food. Danny's mother approached before he could observe from a safe distance. She was a small woman with gray streaks in her dark hair and a smile that reminded him of her son. Without hesitation, she embraced him as if he were a returning family member rather than an alien diplomat. "You must be hungry after your travels," she said. "Come, come. I made extra just in case your species can eat our food. If not, I have other things. Nobody goes hungry in my house." Found himself seated at a long table surrounded by 3 generations of the family. They talked over each other constantly, interrupting and finishing each other's sentences in ways that should have been chaotic but somehow functioned smoothly. They argued about small matters and forgave each other before the arguments were finished. They teased each other mercilessly and defended each other just as fiercely against any outside criticism. A child named Sophia climbed onto the bench beside and stared at him with the fearless curiosity that only the very young possess. "Are you really from space?" she asked. "Yes, I come from a world many light years from here." "Do you have a family on your world?" Considered the question. Had biological relatives, of course, but they did not gather like this. They did not cook food together or argue about trivial matters or embrace strangers who visited their offspring. "I have genetic relations, but we do not interact in this manner." Sophia frowned as if this was the saddest thing she had ever heard. "That sounds lonely. You can share my family if you want. We have lots of people." Before could respond, Danny's mother appeared with a plate of food. She had somehow determined which items on the table would be safe for his alien biology and arranged them in an appealing pattern. When he tried to explain that he did not require sustenance, she waved away his objections and insisted that guests must eat. He ate. The food was surprisingly pleasant. Throughout the afternoon, watched the family and tried to understand what he was seeing. These humans were not all related by blood. He learned that several people at the gathering were neighbors, friends, or partners of family members who had been effectively adopted into the group. The boundaries between family and not family seemed impossibly flexible. Relationships were defined by clear categories. Genetic relations carried specific obligations. Professional connections had established protocols. There was no mechanism for simply absorbing strangers into one's intimate circle based on affection alone. Yet humans did this constantly, extending their kinship to anyone who needed it. Morgan called him the next morning with an urgent request. There had been an incident in a city called Seattle. A building had collapsed and rescue operations were. She thought he might want to observe how humans responded to emergencies. Arrived at the scene expecting organized chaos, he found something else entirely. Hundreds of humans had gathered at the collapsed structure, and while official rescue teams worked with professional equipment, ordinary citizens had also joined the effort. They passed debris from hand to hand in long chains. They brought water and food for the workers. They comforted the families of those trapped inside. He watched a firefighter named Clark work for hours without rest, was covered in dust and sweat, his hands bleeding from contact with rough concrete, but he refused to stop. When his supervisor ordered him to take a break, he argued that people were still trapped. He went back to digging. 16 hours after the collapse, pulled a young girl from the rubble. She was alive, barely, protected by a pocket of space created when a beam fell at just the right angle. Held her carefully as medical teams rushed forward, and saw tears cutting clean lines through the dust on the firefighter's face. Later, when the immediate crisis had passed, approached. "You risked your life for a child you had never met. You worked far beyond reasonable physical limits. Why?" Looked at him with confusion as if the question made no sense. "Because she was trapped and I could help. What else would I do?" "You could have allowed others to take the risk. You could have protected yourself." "Then who would have found her? Everyone else was working other sections. I was in the right place." Shook his head. "Look, I do not understand why you are asking this. Someone needed help. I could give it. That is just what you do." Had no response to this. He had seen species that would sacrifice for their own genetic offspring. He had seen species that would die for their leaders or their ideological causes. But he had never encountered a species where ordinary individuals would destroy themselves for complete strangers simply because help was needed, and they were capable of providing it. On the transport back to his quarters, sat in silence and considered what he had learned. Humans formed bonds with almost aggressive speed. They extended their circles of care to encompass anyone nearby. They treated strangers as potential family and responded to suffering with personal sacrifice rather than rational calculation. This was not weakness. Had initially assumed that such indiscriminate compassion would leave humans vulnerable, easily exploited by more pragmatic species. But watching Clark dig through rubble for 16 hours, watching Maria Santos work double shifts for patients she had just met, watching the family absorb a visiting alien into their gathering without hesitation, he began to see something different. These bonds made humans stronger. They made them fight harder. They made them endure longer. A human protecting a stranger would push past limits that a human fighting for personal gain would never reach. Their compassion was not a vulnerability to be exploited. It was a force multiplier that extended their already remarkable endurance into something that looked almost supernatural. Understood, finally, what had been nagging at him since that first day watching crowds in Tokyo. Humans were never truly alone. Every individual moved through the world surrounded by invisible connections to others, ties of affection and obligation that could be activated at any moment. When you threatened one human, you did not face just that human. You faced everyone who cared about them. And humans, he was learning, cared about almost everyone. He began drafting a new section of his report that night. He was no longer certain what recommendation he would make, but he was very certain that the Galactic Council had underestimated this species badly. The question was whether that underestimation was dangerous. The answer, he suspected, depended entirely on what the Council decided to do next. Requested access to human military capabilities on his 18th day on Earth. The Council would expect this information, and he had been delaying the request for reasons he did not fully understand. Perhaps he already suspected what he would find. Perhaps some part of him was hopping to be proven wrong. Morgan arranged for him to visit a naval base on the coast of California. A woman named Commander Laura met him at the security checkpoint and escorted him inside. She was tall for a human, with sharp eyes and a precise manner of speaking that reminded of military officers from a dozen other species. But unlike those officers, Laura showed no interest in intimidating him or exaggerating her force's capabilities. "We were told to give you complete access," Laura said. "You can see anything you want, ask any questions, we have nothing to hide." This transparency continued to surprise. Every other species he had evaluated had tried to conceal their weaknesses while amplifying their strengths. Humans simply opened their doors and let him look. The base was impressive by the standards of a young spacefaring civilization. Their ships were not particularly advanced compared to galactic technology, but they were solidly built and cleverly designed. What struck most was not the equipment but the people operating it. Every human he observed moved with quiet competence, doing their jobs without drama or hesitation. They worked together seamlessly, communicating in shortcuts and gestures that spoke of long practice. Laura took him to a briefing room and showed him historical records of human military conflicts. She did not glorify the violence or attempt to justify the deaths. She simply presented the facts and allowed to draw his own conclusions. The conclusions were troubling. Humans adapted faster than any species he had encountered. When they faced a new threat, they did not simply respond with existing tactics. They invented new ones. They learned from their failures with terrifying speed and applied those lessons immediately. A strategy that worked against humans once would rarely work a second time. "Your species has survived conflicts that should have destroyed you," observed. "You have won battles you should have lost. How do you explain this?" Laura considered the question carefully before answering. "We do not know how to give up. That sounds like a slogan, but it is actually a strategic reality. Human forces will continue fighting past the point where any rational calculation says they should surrender. We will take losses that would break other armies and keep advancing. We will hold positions long after holding them makes any sense." This is not rational. No, but it wins battles. Enemies expect us to behave logically. They expect us to retreat when the cost becomes too high. When we do not retreat, when we keep coming despite everything, it breaks something in their planning. They do not know how to account for an opponent who refuses to stop. Reviewed the historical data on his own that evening. He ran simulations using Galactic Council military algorithms, plugging in human performance data and behavioral patterns. The results confirmed his growing fears. A human military force, properly supplied and motivated, could outlast opponents many times their size. Their willingness to absorb casualties without breaking meant that traditional attrition strategies would fail against them. Their rapid adaptation meant that technological advantages would be temporary at best, and their tendency to form deep personal bonds meant that every soldier lost would make the survivors fight harder rather than weaker. The Council had assessed humanity based on their technology and their physical capabilities. By those metrics, they were a minor species barely worth cataloging, but those metrics completely missed what made humans dangerous. They did not fight like individuals competing for survival. They fought like a single organism protecting its extended body. Every human soldier had family, friends, comrades whose faces they carried into battle. Every human lost was not just a reduction in numbers but an injury that demanded response. Humans did not forget their dead. They honored them by continuing the fight. Met with and Danny the next morning in a small cafe near his quarters. The meeting was unofficial, just a conversation over the bitter drink that humans called coffee, but had one question he needed answered before he could complete his report. "What does humanity want from the galaxy?" he asked. Danny glanced at, then shrugged. "Explore mostly, see what is out there, meet new people. You have no plans for conquest, no ambitions for territory or resources." Shook her head. "We have enough problems managing our own world. We are not looking to take anyone else's. We just want to be part of things, to learn, to help where we can." Studied her face for signs of deception. He had centuries of experience reading alien expressions, detecting lies and hidden agendas. He found nothing but sincerity in calm brown eyes. She believed what she was saying. Danny, with his easy smile and relaxed posture, believed it too. This was the most frightening revelation of all. Humans did not see themselves as predators. They did not view the galaxy as territory to be conquered. They genuinely wanted to be friends, to be helpful, to be part of a larger community. Their compassion was not a strategy or a deception. It was simply who they were. And that meant the galaxy had no idea what it was dealing with. A species that fought for conquest could be negotiated with. They had clear goals, predictable motivations. But a species that fought to protect what they loved had no upper limit to their commitment. Threaten what humans cared about, and they would not stop until the threat was eliminated. Not defeated, not driven back, but completely and permanently removed. Remembered Clark digging through rubble for 16 hours. He remembered Frank describing how humans kept walking with their broken parts. He remembered Maria Santos holding the hand of a dying stranger because she had promised to care for her patients. These people were not dangerous because they were aggressive. They were dangerous because they were capable of infinite sacrifice when they believed the cause was just. And humans, with their expansive definition of family and their tendency to adopt strangers into their circle of care, could decide almost anyone was worth protecting. "Thank you for your hospitality," said. "I believe I have what I need for my report." Smiled warmly. "We hope it is a good report. We are looking forward to being part of the galactic community." Returned her smile, though the expression felt hollow on his face. Humanity had no idea what their integration into galactic society might mean. They saw opportunity and friendship. They did not see the species that would try to exploit them, the powers that would test their limits, the conflicts that would inevitably arise. And the galaxy had no idea what humanity's response to those challenges would look like. Began packing his belongings that evening. His assessment was complete. He knew what he had to tell the Council. He was not looking forward to the conversation. The Galactic Council chamber had not changed in the 3 weeks since departure for Earth. The same curved benches rose in concentric circles around the central speaking platform. The same representatives from 100 worlds occupied their assigned positions. The same gentle lighting illuminated the proceedings with carefully calculated neutrality. Everything was exactly as remembered it. He was the one who had changed. The ambassador walked slowly toward the speaking platform, aware of the eyes tracking his movement from every direction. He had done this walk countless times before, delivering reports on species the Council would judge. He had always approached this moment with confidence, his conclusions clear and his recommendations solid. Today his steps felt heavy. Today he was not certain he could find the right words. The Council President, an ancient being from a species whose name translated roughly as the Patient Ones, called for attention. "Ambassador has returned from his assessment of the human species. We will now receive his report." reached the platform and stood in silence for a long moment. He could feel the confusion spreading through the chamber. Representatives shifted in their seats. Quiet murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. The ambassador, who had evaluated over 200 species with calm precision, was standing before them with trembling hands and distant eyes. "Ambassador," the president prompted, "your assessment." Looked up at the assembled representatives. He saw the delegation, his own people, waiting with polite expectation. He saw the contingent, eager to hear about a potential new resource for their expanding trade networks. He saw the militant orders of the reaching dawn, already calculating whether humanity might make useful conscripts for their endless border conflicts. None of them understood. None of them had walked through that cemetery. None of them had watched Maria Santos hold a dying stranger's hand or seen Clark dig through rubble until his fingers bled. None of them had sat at the family table and been offered belonging simply because they were present. "The humans are not what we expected," began. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, thin and uncertain. "They are not primitive. They are not simple. They are not a minor species to be catalogued and forgotten." The council waited. Several representatives activated recording devices, preparing to analyze his words for strategic implications. "Humans are a species that carries their wounded. They do not abandon those who fall behind. They do not calculate the cost of caring for those who cannot contribute. They simply refuse to leave anyone behind, regardless of logic or efficiency." The representative made a dismissive gesture. "This is weakness. Such species drain their own resources through sentiment. They will not survive competition with more rational civilizations." Turned to face the directly. "I thought the same thing. I was wrong." He paused, gathering himself. The memories of Earth pressed against his thoughts. The graves at Arlington, Frank's quiet strength, the crowds in Tokyo moving as one organism, Morgan's calm brown eyes. Humans remember their dead. They do not simply process loss and move forward. They carry the memory of everyone they have lost into every decision they make. Every human who dies becomes a reason to fight harder. Every sacrifice becomes fuel for continued resistance. You cannot break human morale through attrition because each loss strengthens their commitment rather than weakening it. The militant orders representative leaned forward with interest. "Then they would make excellent soldiers. Perhaps we should consider—" "You are not listening," interrupted. The harshness in his voice surprised even him. "I am not describing a military asset. I am describing a threat assessment." The chamber fell silent. Humans adapt faster than any species in our records. They learn from defeat and apply those lessons immediately. A tactic that works against them once will not work again. They invent solutions to problems in the middle of fighting those problems. Their technology is not advanced, but their ability to improve that technology under pressure is unprecedented. Took a breath. "And they are connected to each other in ways we do not have categories to describe. They form bonds of loyalty and affection with almost aggressive speed. They adopt strangers into their families. They extend their circle of protection to anyone who earns their trust or simply asks for their help." The council president's ancient eyes narrowed slightly. "You are suggesting that humanity poses a danger to the established order." "I am suggesting that humanity poses a danger to anyone who threatens what they love. And humans love broadly, deeply, and without logical limit. Threaten one human and you threaten everyone who cares about them. Threaten humanity itself, and you will face a species that will not stop fighting until the threat is eliminated. Not defeated, eliminated." Let that word hang in the air. I have evaluated over 200 species for this council. I have seen predators and prey, conquerors and builders, warlike civilizations and peaceful ones. I have never encountered a species like humanity. They are dangerous not because they are aggressive, but because they are capable of infinite sacrifice when they believe they are protecting something that matters. The chamber was completely silent now. Representatives who had been expecting a routine assessment were staring at with various degrees of concern, skepticism, and fear. "My recommendation is simple," said. "Grant humanity full diplomatic status immediately. Treat them with respect. Welcome them into galactic society as equals and potential friends. Because if we give them any reason to see us as enemies, if we give them a cause to unite against a common threat, we will face something this council has never dealt with before." He paused one final time, ensuring every representative understood his next words. "We will face a species that cannot be discouraged, cannot be demoralized, and cannot be stopped. A species that will burn itself to ash before it abandons what it cares about. And once we are their enemy, we will remain their enemy until one side or the other no longer exists. The council president opened his mouth to speak, but was already walking away from the platform. He did not stop for questions. He did not acknowledge the confused calls from various representatives. He walked out of the chamber and did not look back. The vote was held the following day. Humanity was granted full diplomatic status without conditions, the fastest integration in council history. The official record noted that the decision was unanimous, though several representatives had abstained rather than vote against the tide. The unofficial record, shared only among the highest levels of galactic government, contained Ambassador Complete Report. It was classified at the maximum security level and restricted to those with absolute need to know. The report's final conclusion was referenced in whispered conversations for years afterward, though few would admit to having read it. The conclusion stated simply that humanity should be welcomed as friends, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. On Earth, Morgan received notification of the Council's decision via official communication channels. She smiled at the news and forwarded it to Danny with a brief message expressing satisfaction at a job well done. Neither of them had any idea why the notification had arrived so quickly, or why the usually slow diplomatic process had been completed in record time. Neither of them understood the fear that their visitor had carried back to the stars. When back to work, planning the next cultural exchange program, humanity had been welcomed into galactic society. The future looked bright. Somewhere in the cold void between stars, Ambassador sat alone in his quarters and stared at the darkness outside his viewing screen. He would never forget what he had learned on Earth. He would never stop seeing Maria Santos holding that dying man's hand, or Clark weeping over a child he had never met, or the family embracing a stranger simply because he was present. He understood now why the humans had not feared him. They had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. They were exactly what they appeared to be, a species that loved fiercely and protected what they loved without limit. The galaxy was about to meet something it had never seen before, hoped desperately that the meeting would go well. Because if it did not, he knew exactly what would happen next.